Hey YouTube, or probably more specifically my honors students, even more specifically my honors 10 students. I wanted to record a series of videos that kind of tackled some of the literary devices that we need to know in order to kind of have meaningful discussions about literature. Um, some of these will not apply to all genres of literature, obviously, because, poetry, for example, doesn't typically have characters or typically have things like suspense and tension, right? But currently, we're looking at things like short stories, which we really need to have a handle on these sort of basic literary devices to understand and then, also talk about. So, on my list, well, first of all, you might ask, why do I have 10 million Inception screens? I'm actually trying out this new program called OBS, which allows me to screen capture on my computer. I've been kind of messing with it all day, not all day, maybe 3 hours to get the settings to be pretty legit so that I can run some music um, in the background and also have my voice not sound like a crazy echo. So let me minimize that. I've been listening to this Octopath Traveler music. It's from a sort of retro game that I didn't actually buy, but I was really tempted to buy. Um, so let me minimize that. The other thing that I've done recently is I downloaded this program called Wallpaper Engine through Steam, and it allows me to have animated backgrounds that also have sound and change your Windows themes, which is kind of neat. So let's get into what I actually want to talk about, though. I'm going to open up a Word document. I'm going to call this Literary Devices, just because that's easy. And I like to work in Word because it's typically easier to format. So ultimately, one thing that I'm noticing with students is that we may not have as strong of a background in lit devices as I had anticipated. Now, that's not really a problem because we can go through and learn those things together, but there are some basic devices that we have to absolutely know in order to do the things that we're trying to do with literature. I'm going to make this a bigger font just so everyone can see that pretty well. Let's make this bold. Calibri, let's do Times New Roman because Times New Roman is a MLA formatted, acceptable MLA font. So one of the first things that we have to know how to talk about is plot. So plot is kind of the low-hanging fruit of the literary device kingdom, and everyone should be able to talk about it. Plot's going to include exposition. I'll put this down here. Actually, let me define plot. This is the sequence of events in the story. This will break down into exposition. It's going to break it down into conflicts, rising action, climax, falling action, and resolution, or this French word, denouement, which means the unraveling or the sort of solution to the plot. This stuff I expect that most of you guys already know. However, along with plot, there are a couple devices that help move the story around. So the first one is going to be suspense, then tension, then foreshadowing. And all of these kind of work together. When the author gives us a hint or does some foreshadowing, we're going to be put into suspense because we're going to be waiting to see the sort of cash in on that foreshadowing. Like if you show us a keg of dynamite at the beginning of an Acme film, that dynamite better blow up by the end, or else we're going to be pretty frustrated as an audience. This is actually called Chekhov's gun. So there's this very famous short story writer named, I think it's Alexander Chekhov. Chekhov's gun. This means that any foreshadowing should reveal something in the plot by the end. He says something like this: if a gun is shown in Act 1, then it better be fired by Act 3. Okay. And I'm not sure if that's the exact quote, but that's what I remember about Chekhov. So with foreshadowing, let me go through and define some of these. I'm going to leave the exposition, conflict, all of this stuff for plot basically undefined because you guys know that. But suspense, this is going to be when the audience has to wait for some kind of expected outcome in the future of the story. All right. The key to understanding suspense is the fact that we have to wait for something. All right. So I'm going to make that red. And it's an expected outcome because of what the author has been doing, right? So they set us up to expect that something is going to happen, and then we have to wait for that to happen, all right? Whenever we're in suspense, we also experience tension, all right? I know that suspense and tension are real words in the real world, but we have to look at them as literary devices a little bit differently. So you might say something like, I feel tense, like in the real world, but we don't feel tension in the literary world. We experience it, and it causes us to feel some sort of feeling, all right? So this is what the audience experiences while they are in suspense, and it can cause a wide array of emotion. Okay. So it's going to be something that causes a certain kind of emotion. All right. Now with that, we have to be sure that we're talking about the type of emotion there. Okay. Foreshadowing, this is going to be the author gives a hint or clue about what is going to happen in the future of the story. All right. And for this one, we really need to be thinking about that idea that this is a hint or a clue to give us an idea of like what might happen. Now, if we want to be, thinking from an author's perspective, sometimes the author can give us a hint or a clue, and then they can change the outcome to something that we were not expecting. And we actually call that irony, which is another term that you should know in order to talk about literature on a sort of basic level. So this is when the audience's expectation does not meet the outcome of the story, okay, or what happens in the story. It must be radically different than what was expected. Okay, so like for example, if the audience were to be expecting that a young boy would come knocking at their door, and it actually wasn't a young boy, it was a young girl, that would not necessarily be ironic. It's not radically different than what the audience is expecting, all right? Now, if we were expecting, a visitor at our door, and we were expecting that visitor to probably be human, but it was actually like an alien from outer space, now that would be ironic, right? Because it's radically different than what we were expecting. For this, we need to be talking about expectation. So I'm going to make that red, and outcome, or else we're not really talking about irony, all right? So I'm going to move this down, to elsewhere. So we have all of our plot elements, right? These are things that we should all understand from either middle school or last year's classes. So exposition, this is the setting, time, and the characters in the story. Okay, conflict, this is going to be major problem in the story, or the overarching problem. Note, there can also be conflict between characters that drives the story as well. So character conflict can also create suspense and tension, right? So some sort of conflict happens and we're in suspense waiting to see what the outcome of that conflict will be, right? Once we have our conflict, we start to have rising action. So this is going to be any time that the conflict is worsened or becomes more complicated. Which, you know, again, I think you guys know, this is when the conflict cannot become more complicated or worsen any further. Falling action is when we start to resolve the conflict, so these are the small things that change the rising action or sort of reverse the rising action. This is action that solves the conflict piece by piece. There's usually several falling actions, and usually they're related to the rising action. The resolution, this is when the conflict is completely resolved. Okay. Now I'm going to tell you sort of like analogy so that you can kind of understand plot if you've ever struggled with it. My college professor, Dorina Wright, who was one of my favorite professors, she's this super smart lady. She said basically a good analogy for the plot is to think of a rope or string, okay? She talked about a rope because within plot there can also be subplot, and in a rope there are many strings put together to make a rope happen, right? So you could think of each string as a subplot that's going on. But let's just talk about it as if it were a string, right? Just like a single piece of thread. So if there's your string and you know you have it and it's straight, basically when we have conflict we tie a knot in the string, okay? And as that story becomes more complicated, when we have rising action we tie another knot in the string and another and another and another. Eventually we reach a point where we cannot tie any more knots in the string, right? Because it's just become a giant mass of knots, which is our climax, okay? Once we get to that point, we can only start undoing the knots, which is falling action. Every time we undo a knot, it's going to be, you know, working towards the resolution or the denouement, right? The denouement literally, like I said, means the unraveling, right? So it's the complete unraveling of those knots. And that's where we want to get by the end of the story. If you ever want to check if your resolution or your conflict are correct, you really just need to look at the conflict and ask yourself, does the resolution solve that conflict? It may not be a positive ending, because stories often have negative endings, but if the resolution solves your conflict, you've probably identified both correctly, all right? So similarly, if you're struggling with where the climax of a story is, you might ask yourself, when do things start to get better in the story? And that's going to help you identify where the climax is, because you can just look right before that, and typically it's the most complicated part. I like to use that word complicated because, to be honest, it gets taught wrong in middle school. Teachers will say things like, it's the most intense part. And it isn't always the most intense part. It often is, but it isn't always, okay? So I want to go down and talk about these things just a little bit more. Suspense, tension, foreshadowing, and irony. These are sort of the definitions. I want to talk about how we might identify those things and how we might sort of talk about those things in another video. But overall, to talk about plot, you really need to understand this stuff, right? To understand what an author does with plot, you really need to understand this stuff here. And those are kind of the basics if you want to talk about something like a short story, right? But if we were talking about, let's say, poetry, we would have to understand a whole other set of literary devices. So for now, I'm going to actually stop this video, and then I'm going to kind of start creating some videos on suspense and tension, foreshadowing, irony, and hopefully those will be able to kind of help you guys figure out how to do commentary, because we're currently struggling with some of that stuff. Hopefully this video was helpful. If you have found it helpful, if you're not in my class and you're actually just some rando on YouTube, please like and subscribe and comment if you'd like. If you're a student, you can like and subscribe if you want, but again, I'm not trying to become an influencer or anything like that. So having said that, Megan here signing off.